Okay, we are back along the Dalmatian coast, and I can't tell you just how good it feels to be putting out manageable length episodes for a stretch. You know what, I've kept very light with calls to action on the channel so far. For once, I want to put this right at the front of the episode. We've been enjoying a bit of an uptick to the channel recently, which we massively appreciate. And yes, if you'd hit like on this and also subscribe, that would make a huge difference because in the YouTube scheme of things, we are still absolutely tiny. But back to business. As you know, we've messed with the episode order a bit. If you haven't caught the episode so far, we're heading all the way down the Croatian Adriatic, although by now we've both disrupted the geographical order north to south and the chronological order we were visiting them. So this makes our Split episode a bit hard to write. There was a lot going on. We were in and out. Split itself is kind of manic. The other cities we've been to so far all seem pretty chilled by the time you ducked into the cool of a narrow side street. But Split is the second largest city in Croatia, coming just behind the capital Zagreb. The airport is a major entry point to the Adriatic, as well as Split being a popular destination in its own right. So there is a lot of footfall both here and through here. And because people tend to infer some sort of disdain from our descriptions if I don't spend an entire episode gushing nothing but praise for a location, let me just say it now, the old town of Split is a beautiful maze to dive into, a fascinating puzzle that takes you a few days to figure out, and even then, it'd be years before you'd figured out all the little corners and nooks that are tucked away down the incalculable side alleys. Coupled with being drenched by the Adriatic sun and filled with history, it's an incredibly exciting place to be and an absolute must-see, and we had a fantastic time. So our first view of it came from the bus as we linked from Šibenik. The mountains had been gradually creeping higher as we travelled south, and you could feel the landscape getting busier and more crowded even before you first catch sight of Split. Being a major town, it does not, of course, exist purely for the entertainment of visitors. In fact, as you go in, you pass a lot of high-rises and just big city stuff. But like pretty much everywhere else along the Adriatic, when you get to the coast, you reach the nucleus of the urban area with the old town, and this is where Split really shines. Split is quite unlike any city from antiquity. It radiates out from a unique central structure, a fortified palace complex that was built by the Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian was a Roman emperor from about the 2 to 300s who did a lot to get the Roman Empire back on its feet after the 3rd century crisis, but whilst also enacting the largest and harshest purges on Christians that the empire had ever experienced. Split was originally built as Diocletian's palace, like the whole place, this entire square here, that was the structure. In fact, palace is a bit of an oversimplification as the whole complex served some other functions, but he essentially built it for his retirement. He had the distinction of being an emperor who retired from the role as opposed to dying in it, but spoiler alert.
Spoilers from history.
He was called out of retirement to assist the emperors, yes, plural, that he'd put in place. What's more remarkable, the original structure is still very much visible in the core of the town. While in subsequent centuries, people would build a town out of the carcass of the palace, a lot of it still stands in roughly the same form as it was in the 4th century. It's a major UNESCO site, but there's more going on in the old town outside of this. I mean, here's the square of Diocletian's palace, and then to the west, that's sort of the Venetian and medieval overspill, though the ancient and medieval layers of the town blend pretty seamlessly. It does make for a very unusual town layout. You have a large open plaza in front of the palace area. I mean, it would be a nice open plaza, but it's just crammed full of stalls. This is a recurring problem with Split. Just canopies and stalls and chairs and stuff everywhere. Look, it's great to have lots of space to accommodate people and to sit, sure, but it does stop you from being able to take a step back and appreciate the structure. Instead, you can only just catch glimpses of it here and there. Usually in an episode, I go through things in the order we saw them, but with Split, it's largely irrelevant, as we would sort of dive into the labyrinth and then after a while emerge somewhere else and then delve back in again. While all the streets do look bafflingly similar when you're inside, it gets easier after your first day. I mean, on the first day in the city, I was a bit like, I could spend 1,000 lifetimes here and still only glimpse all that is within this ancient edifice. But then by day 3, I was like, oh yeah, it's over there. So yeah, this is one of the very few cases where I kept overestimating the size of a city. I am famously prone to pointing us towards a landmark, only to discover it's an hour's walk away, and there's a mountain and a fast-flowing river in the way. Laid out flat on a field, you could probably jog to either side of the old town of Split in under 3 minutes. As well as the tangle of enigmatic streets, there's the outer shell of the palace. It's got a couple of monumental gates which have been partly reconstructed, and they're pretty impressive. Underneath all of this, you have the catacombs. There's a main walkway that anyone can walk through, so long as you don't mind more tourist stalls. But then there's also more to see in a part you pay entry for, and while I happened to do this near last, I actually wish I'd done it earlier. As you walk around the underground footprint of the palace and see the extent of it, it really does help you get a feel for the palace in antiquity, far more than the newer street plan. There's also a joint ticket for a cluster of things to see in the middle of the palace complex. Some of these are more worthwhile than others. The Temple of Jupiter is worth a nosy inside, but it is just the one room. There's not loads to see in there, but this historic font is a pretty significant piece of early Croat art. It's more impressive from the outside, to be honest. The museum has some good stuff in it, though not sure how much of it would appeal to the non-history fans. There's a catacomb. Now, confusingly, this is not the main catacombs that I just mentioned. There's this other isolated catacomb below the cathedral, which is, it's not all that much. But then the cathedral, that's pretty impressive. It's also an amusing historical middle finger to Diocletian. As a man who set about torturing and murdering Christians with great enthusiasm, it's quite the poetic irony that his mausoleum has been transformed into a church. The star attraction is the view from the top of the bell tower. So we were growing quite accustomed to climbing bell towers by now after the Venetian bell tower in Zadar. Notice the similarities? And the one in Cortula as well. Fun enough, since it's probably the most visited of any of those, the Split one was probably the most intimidating yet. You tell yourself that you're just being silly and your understandable reticence at height is just something to ignore. And yet these plates that make up the floor, they creak and move, which is like, no, wrong answer. What I want to hear from you is nothing. I want you to sit there very still and metallic and defy gravity for me. I was hoping we'd be on the same page about that. But anyway, definitely worth it to see the city from above. And of course, you don't need me to guide you through every column and corner. There's just a lot to discover. All of that we saw on the day we returned from Cortula with our bags still on our backs, so it was a relief to finally get to our accommodation where we were staying. It was a tiny city centre apartment, which was quite well hidden in the tangle. Not loads to say about it, whereas I've been quite enthusiastic about our accommodation up to this point. This was just functional. It was fine. By the bed, these strings had an interesting way of acting as a seismometer for when someone was walking around on the floor above. The fridge was painted red for whatever reason. They were also kind enough to provide us with some spaghetti, but no hob or oven of any kind. So unless we just dropped it in the kettle and boiled that over and over, I'm not sure what they were going for with that. But look, it was fine. So we were back and forth, in and out. The next morning, I did head to the Venetian fort of Split, which is sufficiently removed from the main historic core that I guess many tourists probably don't end up seeing it. It's also uncommonly well camouflaged. The tradition of using Venetian forts for parking spaces continues apace. As well, having heard these shrill bird calls, saw a female peacock and chicks running around, which you'd never normally see. Okay, so having seen most of what Split has to offer in the Old Town, you do need to make your way a little further out. Now, we'd planned carefully around Split's bus network, and there's no shortage of buses crisscrossing the urban area. However, where we wanted to go was not quite as well catered for. We'd bought a ticket from here well in advance of 9:15 when the bus was due to leave. It was a little bit late, and then a bit more late, and then sunk cost fallacy sets in, and before you know it, an hour has passed. The lady at the ticket stand was certainly expecting to show up, and this was stop number 1, so it wasn't our error. There was also an American couple nearby who'd made the same mistake as us to believe the bus would actually appear at the time and route it was scheduled. So we sort of decided between the four of us that we could split a cab, and this turned out to be a preferable option to waiting another half hour for the semi-mythical Route 22. The motorway snakes out of the north of the city, and while I'm no structural engineer, you have to admire the obvious determination of whoever was planning and building this route. It's basically, we're just going to go straight into the mountains, we'll cut a tunnel there, then a large flyover, then another tunnel, and it just ploughs right through all of it. While you're still a long way off, you can see our eventual target. On a mound in the middle of a passage between the major mountains is the castle of Klis. Low-angle flag shot. pretty much every culture we have a name for who is in the area over the last 2,000 years, and even a bit before, had at least something to fortify this point. It's a key pass through the mountains and into the heart of the Balkans, and over the centuries it would see major conflict between the Ottomans and the various changing powers in controlling the coast, including, my boys, the Venetians! That's probably the least Venetian thing you could possibly do. That's better. So Klis is well worth seeing. It's somewhat Thronesy, as there were some sequences shot there, as well as in the Split catacombs. You know, it's funny, when I started making travel blogs, Game of Thrones was still culturally significant, but in the last few years that have passed, pointing out filming locations at this point seems as irrelevant as the show itself has largely become. The castle isn't the most fairy tale fortress you've ever seen, but the views, I mean, yeah, those alone would have made this worth the trek. So you don't want to miss that. Next, we, perhaps foolishly, decided we'd see if the bus would show up for a return trip. We parked ourselves up at a cafe, which gave us a good view of the road in either direction. I got an espresso and an Ojusko, and then suddenly the bus zoomed past. It's actually a small point of pride how quickly I managed to knock back the espresso and the entire bottle of Ojusko, but as we ran to the bus, it paused at the stop, the driver got out, and yes, turns out the bus wasn't leaving for another half an hour. So, having made ourselves look very foolish in front of everyone at the cafe, we drifted back to our recently vacated seats and sat down to wait it out. But hey, what are the odds? We actually got to ride the bus that was on the timetable. What a privilege. So, after the bus comes down the mountain, we stopped off in Solin for the other big draw in the area. This is the Roman town of Salona. We had originally lined up our day so we wouldn't be there in the heat of the day, but the number 22 had other plans, so we just boiled ourselves alive getting coverage of the ruins. This was the hottest part of the hottest day of what had been a pretty hot week. You could also see what appeared to be a pretty major forest fire creeping up the mountain in the distance. I mean, I could sympathise. It was so hot I wouldn't have been that surprised if I spontaneously burst into flames myself. There is a funny thing with this site, by the way. If you enter the site through the main gate from the north, a guy at the gift shop will stop you and ask for the entrance fee, which is about 40 kuna each, so not much. But the site is also accessible by paths from all directions, and there seems to be no gates or booths or anything. So, I'm not recommending it, but it seems like from almost any other direction you can just wander into this site for free, which is a bit weird. In the future, we will have much more of a breakdown of the Roman stuff that's here. It's a pretty special archaeological park. It's got to be one of the more significant Roman sites in Croatia, helped by the fact it got so pummeled by invading armies in the 700s that the site was abandoned entirely, leaving the ruins in their current form, and also leading to the area around Split becoming the focus of settlement as it was more defensible. At the far end to the west are the ruins of the amphitheatre, and that's quite something. We would have lingered a while more, but staying out in the heat any longer would have been a death sentence, so we limped back towards civilization, or just literally anywhere that had drinks. We eventually got to a cafe on the outskirts of the modern town of Solin and plonked ourselves down there with a slightly crazed look in our eyes. We might have slightly alarmed our waitress, but I have never had an ice-cold beer taste so sweet. Solin is a bit of a funny place. There's a lot more other little historical tidbits there, but with the heat being what it was soon time to head back to Split. After recouping for a bit, we actually did aim for a beach that evening. Now, I've already mentioned this with our Adriatic episodes, and sorry if this is old news to you, but coming from the UK, this seems a bit strange. You see, in the UK, where you have coastline, sometimes it's just a filthy industrial dockyard, like every square inch of Southampton, and it might occasionally be towering cliffs that drop straight into the sea, but pretty much everywhere else that doesn't fit that description equals beach. Sort of. Mostly. Now, the Adriatic coast is utterly gorgeous, but almost none of it counts as beach. The order basically goes pine trees, lots of rocks, water. That's it. The beaches are generally tiny strips of specially placed sand, and they rarely seem to be right by the main towns. In the case of Split, if you go just beyond the train station, which is used by approximately no people ever, because there's not really many trains going anywhere, you get to this rather unusual spot. I mean, there's water. Sure, it'll do. Amusingly, the water is only just knee height for quite a long way out, so everyone is just standing there with barely 20% of their person actually immersed in the water. But cool. Then, with a little time left, we wandered up the hill overlooking Split. This is actually well worth heading to. Split is pretty hectic wherever you look, But as you head further up the hill, you get into these charming little old-fashioned houses, and pretty soon you feel like you're in a small Adriatic village tucked away from it all. There's a bit of a selfie spot a little further up. It is just well worth it for the views, and you could spend a nice lazy evening there away from the busyness. Oh, and rather strange, when we came down the hill, it turned out a couple of motorbikes had just burst into flames at the waterfront, creating a small amount of chaos. So, what else is there to say about Split? Well, I mean, that's most of it. I can remember scampering around it considerably more than just the places I've unpacked here, but I don't need to guide you around every corner and back street. Much better for you to discover it for yourselves. And yes, the following day we were on the boat to Var, and then the day after that I was on a secret mission, which you'll hear about soon. But then all of a sudden, it was our final day. Now, there was a slightly fiddly Easter egg I really wanted to get to. It's right on the edge of town and too far out of the old town to be convenient to walk the whole thing. We saw it every time we came to Split on the main dual carriageway, and with some slightly fiddly bus work and a not inconsiderable stride across an industrial estate, we got here. But totally worth it. I'm not sure Jen agreed with me on that one, as it was about 35 degrees and we had all our luggage on our backs, but Diocletian's Aqueduct. Yeah, surprisingly well preserved stretch considering it's just on the outskirts of town in an industrial area. I mean, the highway isn't doing it any favours, ambience-wise, but it's one of the better surviving aqueducts you'll see in Eastern Europe. I didn't think we'd make it over here, so I was glad we did. And then a small cross-country jog to the bus stop, which was not exactly nearby, to get to one last stop before our flight. Now, you'll forgive me if I don't say a tremendous amount about Trogir, as we were only there a few hours, and most of the substantive things to say about the architecture really belong in the Venetian episode, as that's largely what makes the town significant. You can see why it made for a good spot for a fortified town. It's an island, but only just barely. There's some spectacular architecture to see, courtesy of a few historic churches. The castle is pretty great and gives you great views of the town. Otherwise, bit of a flying visit just before linking to the airport, which is pretty much right next door. Okay, final wrap-up. There's pretty good coffee and food in Split. It doesn't really merit a detailed breakdown, but particular shout-out on the coffee front to this spot just outside of the city wall. This place was also really good. Did see Split a little bit at night time, though we were having such full-on days with 5 a.m. starts. We weren't hugely in a party kind of mood when it came to nighttime. There was a fair amount of buzz around our accommodation and back streets, but most of the action is down by the waterfront. There's a rather novel way people have managed to navigate the problem of supplying a city with streets barely wide enough to fit a bike, let alone a car. You'll see these thin cart things, I don't actually know what you'd call these, you'll see those buzzing around the streets anyway. You'd probably picked up on this, but the real treat in Split is both seeking the Roman arches and fragments submerged in the town, but also the streets themselves. They are such a treat to untangle. It's a real delight just delving down these enigmatic side alleys only to pop out somewhere completely unexpected. There's quite a few lesser-known little historical secret spots, which I'm saving both for the Venetian series and future Roman episodes, though goodness knows they feel a long way off. So that's all from Split. Next time we're heading further south again, and I have been looking forward to this for a long time. We're going to do things a little bit differently. I'll say no more than that for now. The music you've been hearing in the background is ours. You can support the channel by purchasing that on bandcamp.com. Find us on the social medias, drop us a subscribe here, and definitely check back for the next episode, otherwise we'll catch you very soon.